Guys, Forward Ministries here, Pastor Lanessa. So we started a Bible study going through the book of Exodus and seeing what's going on in Exodus and how it applies to us in 2019. You'll have to excuse me, my allergies are just horrendous today. And so I'm going to use the ESV. It's probably what I'm going to use from here on out with the book of Exodus. And so I just want to kind of jump into it. I'm going to try and give you the highlights. It was a pretty long study this week. And so in Exodus 3, when we first look at Exodus 3, Moses is tending to the flock. And so here's what it says. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, or Mount Sinai. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire, and out of the midst of a bush he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off, for the place you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. Or the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. All right. So the first thing that we notice, and excuse me, because I will probably be getting some tissues out, yeah. So the first thing we notice is that Moses is a shepherd, and he's been shepherding for about 40 years now. It's a far cry from where he came from in Egypt, which was the royal Egyptian family. And at this point, he's 80 years old, and so he's out on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, depending on your translation. It's the same mountain. What I like about this passage right off the bat is that Moses is minding his own business, and what we see is God pursue Moses, which is what we've seen throughout the entire Bible so far. It's God that pursues us, and he begins to speak to him. I think Moses, being a shepherd, would have taught him several things. It would have taught him humility from falling from such a high social economic status in Egypt to now being the shepherd, which shepherds were detested in Egypt. And he would have learned a great deal of patience and compassion dealing with sheep. They're not the brightest animal, and tending to their ailments. And so those are things that God would have used, or did go on to use, for his cause when Moses begins to shepherd the Israelite people. So he goes from one flock to another flock, so to speak. And I like to point out that Moses really at this point has embraced his life. We don't see him fretting over the past or keeping himself chained to unforgiveness, his past mistakes. He's moved forward. He's growing, he's developing, and I think for the most part he's thriving where he's at. And it's, I think, a contrast to what we saw him doing in Egypt. I don't think he was thriving. I don't think his faith was growing. He's walking before God, trying to save the Israelites instead of waiting on God. And so we'll see what's going to happen. And so in verse 2, the Lord appears to Moses. And so appeared means materialized. He materialized as this fire burning this bush. And I want to point out that John Gill says that it's not a created angel that begins to speak to Moses. Gill says that it is the very presence of God, and he goes on to say the external word and the Son of God. The same angel of the Lord that appeared to Abraham. And I completely agree with Gill. And so, why did God appear as a burning bush? Well, to get Moses' attention. God's going to do something to get our attention. And that's what he's doing. Moses understood fire to consume and to destroy. This fire is not doing that. It's not destroying, it's not consuming. And there's a lot of theories, a lot of speculation as to what that symbol means. Listen, God's glory is all consuming, but it will not consume the people that submit to it. And so we, in return, as Christians in 2019, have been given the light of Jesus Christ, not to consume people with it, but to illuminate the way for people with it. And so eventually that fire would be placed within Moses, which would be the Holy Spirit, and he would go on to lead the people out of Egypt. And you know, he turns aside. And so I think what we're seeing is, you know, as Moses turns aside to see what's going on, God begins to call to him, and Moses immediately responds. So he recognizes the voice of God. He's not fearful. And so what we see is that God calls to a lot of people, but only few respond to him. And Moses responded out of his own free will, which I think is important to take note of. And he says, take off your shoes, Moses, because you're standing on holy ground. Listen, we don't have the authority to barge into God's presence without an invitation or being prepared. His invitation prepares us in itself. As Christians, we're given the invitation through Jesus Christ, and Jesus prepares us, makes us ready for the presence of God. And so the emphasis right here is God's calling to Moses is that Moses was set aside for a supernatural purpose. God goes on to identify himself in this passage as the God of his ancestors. So he knows without a shadow of a doubt who specifically is calling him into this great work that he's getting ready to go into, kicking and screaming. And when we move on in the passage, well, let me just say this. The Word of God says that, you know, as God began to speak to Moses, and he realized who he was speaking to, Moses hid his face. He looked away. And he does that not because he's terrified, but out of respect and reverence. It's a worship. I'm not worthy to look at the face of God. I'm a sinful man. And so he looks away, right? That's what the glory of God does. We look away, and then he cleanses us. Now we know that Moses is going to go sit in the presence of the Lord. But when we move on, God says in verse 7, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and heard their cries. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen their oppression. I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should go to Egypt? And God says, but I will be with you, and this will be a sign for you, that I've sent you. When you brought the people back out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So I want to point out a few things. God is personally going to save his people, and that's specifically what he says. I personally have seen what's going on. I'm personally going to save them. I've come down to deliver them. So God's personal. It's personal. This is a personal mission because God's a personal God. He also gives Moses two promises. He says, I will be with you. I'm not going to abandon you. God never abandons us, ever, especially if he calls us into work. And we're all called into a work. We might not all be called to teach the Word of God, but we're all called into a work for God. And the second thing he tells Moses is that he would serve him on Mount Sinai. And so I think the emphasis is that God, hey, nothing goes unnoticed. I've seen, and I'm going to act. He might be silent for a while, but he's always working toward a solution for the right time. And I think that's important. Sometimes we want to jump ahead of God. We have to wait on God's timing. And so when we think back to when Moses killed the Egyptian foreman, you know, for beating the Israelite, he's walking ahead of God. That's what we see. He's kind of getting out of God's alignment. But now God's going to place his vision within Moses. He's going to make Moses ready for the right time. And so God uses the word deliver, which means he's going to release and rescue. I'm going to release and rescue my people. This is not the plans that I had for them. And then he goes on to say, this is the plans that I have. I want them to go into this land. It's a land that's, you know, full of milk and honey. In other words, it's an abundant land that will provide for their needs and be a blessing for them. And so the call on Moses's life is what we see in the next, in these verses. And so Moses gives 5 excuses as to why he cannot possibly fulfill what God is saying to him. The first one that he says is, who am I that I should go, right? God says, come and I will send you. The word come means to move or travel. I want to move you, Moses, in a forward motion into what I see for you, into this vision. It's a making progress. The word come can also mean arise, which I think really fits this passage better. So in other words, he's saying, arise, Moses, I'm going to send you to the work. To which Moses shrieks in horror, and I think a lot of us do. And so Moses immediately responds with but. and the word but is a phrase or a clause used to contrast what's being said. And so Moses is differing with God's vision for his life. Hey, you got the wrong man. And so from the moment Moses opens his mouth to protest God's call on his life, we see the devil at work, because that's just how he operates. Immediately the devil begins to raise conflicting thoughts within Moses of doubt. Remember, 40 years earlier, Moses was ready to kill all the Egyptian foremen and rescue his people, and now he's kind of shrieking away in trepidation and horror that he would be called out. And so that's not what God gives us. God gives us a spirit of power and love and self-control, not trepidation. And so what we see is God constantly reassure Moses throughout chapters 3 and 4. And it's a constant reassurance. And so the next thing that we see in verse 13 is where Moses says, gives a second excuse. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say? And so God responds with, I am who I am. And so I don't want to read this whole passage, but I want to point out that God grants us or affords us to have reasonable inquiry, right? How is this going to work? We see that with Mary when she says to the angel, well, I'm a virgin. How am I going to get pregnant? That is a reasonable inquiry. Moses, at this point, just has faltering faith. He's seen all kinds of supernatural occurrences at this point. He knows that it's God, and yet he's kind of fretting and arguing with God. And I think most of us should be able to identify with that. And so he's really gone beyond reasonable inquiry and into unreasonable doubt. Who am I that you should sin? Well, God says you're somebody because I make you somebody. So when you say that to God, I want you to remember that you're somebody because God makes you somebody. And then he says, I don't have the ability to convey your identity to the people of Israel. And God says, well, yes, you do. You do have that ability, and here's what you're going to say. In ancient culture, it was important when you were conveying someone's identity to know something essential about them, to which God provides for Moses. And so God does tell Moses how to convey his identity. And then he reassures him again, I am, right? I am self-existent, and I have always been there. I'm eternal. That's who I want you to tell my people that I am. And they understand that. They will understand that. And so what we see is that really God goes on to provide Moses with 2 speeches in verses 15 through 22, which I'm not going to read through. It's just too long. But he gives Moses a speech for the elders, and then he goes on to kind of give Moses this little mini preview of what will happen with Pharaoh. And so what we see over and over in Exodus is that God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob over and over and over again. And then he makes promises, and he is going to fulfill those promises, and that's what he says to the Israelite people. And so, again, he reassures the people that he has seen their hardships. And then we see Pharaoh, a preview that Pharaoh's going to reject God's will, or a refusal to obey God. And, there's a point in there where God says, hey, look, I want you to ask Pharaoh to let my people go a 3 days journey so they can sacrifice to me. That's kind of a test. And I like what William MacDonald says. He says, the 3 days journey was a mere test to see how Pharaoh would respond. We have always the freedom to obey or disobey the Lord. He is a gentleman, and he's not going to force himself upon us. Pharaoh absolutely had the opportunity and ability and right to disobey the Lord, but there were going to be dire consequences. There's always dire consequences when we choose to disobey and not trust the Lord. And so he would see the wonders of God, which means the plagues that would come upon him as judgment on him and his people. And so really that kind of concludes chapter 3. I want you to remember, and when you read the end of chapter 3, it says, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor or anybody that lives in her house for silver and jewelry, that you shall put them on your sons and daughters. You shall plunder the Egyptians. Plunder the Egyptians. Remember, this is a people that readily obeyed Pharaoh to drown the male infants not too long ago. So really, to plunder them of their wealth, I feel like is the least of their punishments. But really what we see in chapter 3 is God's incredible love and patience and his constant reassurance to Moses that you are somebody. I don't hold you captive to your past. I make you new. All things are new in me. I'm going to send you forward. Your past doesn't dictate your future. And I'm going to be with you. I will not leave you. And I think God still says that to people today. You're not a prisoner of your past. I will make you new with a new identity, and I will be with you. So I don't know where you're at in your faith walk, but I want you to remember that you have a new identity in Jesus Christ. He will never abandon you. He will always be with you. I don't care what religious people say. Forget religion. It's about relationship. And so I hope you are loved and that you loved well and are blessed. And so next we'll do chapter 4.